Welcome, everyone, to another of these wonderful conversations that I always enjoy very, very much. I haven't done one for a while. There's been a lot going on in life, such is life. And I'm really excited today to be meeting with and talking to Jeffrey Sorensen. Jeff is the expression and embodiment of breathARMY and the LightFORCE Collective and Breathwork Facilitator Training Academy. Jeff's mission is to educate, inspire, and empower people to live their true potential, which is pretty much in alignment with what my mission is. He uses a variety of tools, including breathwork, movement, meditation, cold, heat, and psychedelics to help people break through the structures that hold us back from living and expressing our true potential in the world. I'm also going to read out a little bit of your background here, Jeff, if I may, just take a few more moments in the intro because it's really worth it, because we're going to cover some of this stuff during today's chat. So Jeff has studied extensively and mentored and trained with some of the world's leading experts like Wim Hof, Mackenzie, Patrick McKeown, Irene Lyon, Jhenneviev Heartt, Craig Perkins, and David Shannahoff Khalsa. And these influences have led Jeff to the creation of his own breathARMY, a unique offering that is there in support of us reconnecting to our true nature and innate potential. There's an awful lot more about Jeff's certifications and qualifications and who he's worked with, actually, which I'm going to put in the show notes at the bottom. But I really want to be able to dive into this extensive journey and the pathway that Jeff has come on, because I suspect if you stay tuned that you're going to learn a lot, be inspired a lot, and just come to realize how much we can do, which is also part of my story, when we stay determined to change our story. So welcome, Jeff. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, I came across you initially on Instagram, actually, through the
Mhm.
many threads. I always feel like the world of breathwork is a bit like the mycelium network, that, the more we're immersed in it, the more we start to know who's doing what kind of work is showing up in the world, and names pop up. Your name popped up. And I've got to admit, initially I was like, army. How do I feel about that? How do I feel about the use of the word army in relation to breath and spirit, which I'd love to talk to you about. But then also was very fascinated with how you hold yourself. Came to one of your Sunday sessions, absolutely loved the grounded steadiness and the calm guidance that you gave that allowed me personally to drop in really deeply. So tell us a little more about how breathARMY came to be here. Like, what's your story, basically? Oh, you're muted.
There we go.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a couple of different threads to pull on there. One being how did Breath Army come into being,
Yeah.
and the other being what's my story, and that's a longer story. So maybe I'll start with how did Breath Army come into being, and Breath Army really was an idea or a concept that really just dropped into my lap. It came in ceremony about 6 years ago. And I'd been teaching yoga and meditation and pranayama for many years before that, and had landed back in Canada and kind of stepped aside from teaching for a few years, and had come to a point where I recognized it was time to get back into the teaching world and get back in the arena.
Mm.
And that's when breath work really came in strong for me. I'd had many conscious connected breathing experiences prior to that, and it hadn't quite grabbed me yet. It had piqued my interest, but it hadn't been the thing. And there was a couple of different experiences that had happened earlier that year that made me feel like I really wanted to pursue breath work. And
Mm,
And one of those experiences was my own healing path and recognizing how dysregulated my breathing had become throughout the course of my journey and how important of a thread that had been in my own healing. And so when I really decided to dive into the world of breath, I had been sitting in ceremony, and this idea of breathARMY just kind of landed in my lap, and it was spelled the exact way that it is right now, with breath in small letters and army in big letters. And I really didn't know what it was at that point, and I was even maybe a little bit embarrassed to talk about it. As I got back into the world of teaching, I kind of hesitantly used that name, and then over time it just felt more and more in alignment to follow and to try and understand what that energy was more and more.
mm,
And so I think for me, when I think about breath, I I think about often what I think about is the interesting disconnection that we've made in the English language in between the breath, respiration, and life or spirit, and how we've really kind of pigeonholed it as this physiological process. But for me, when I look at the name breathARMY, I think I could replace that word breath with spirit, and spirit or life. And the army to me is a movement. It's a collection of people that are moving together with a collective purpose. And so to me, that's to bring our true potential back into the world and really recognize who we are, what our potential is, and our capacity that we have to co-create our reality. And so to me, that's what breathARMY is all about. Breathing, breath work, meditation, movement, cold, heat, psychedelics, these are all kind of vehicles to bring that awareness to the forefront.
many of my favorite vehicles to bring that
Mm.
awareness to the front that you've shared there. So that is, in essence, the collective purpose of Breath Army is to elevate those levels of consciousness and to bring back together that disconnect of the science and the spirit.
Absolutely.
Mm,
Yeah, I love the science, and for me that was one of the big draws to get into breath work.
mm,
Was I could see after many years of yoga and meditation the challenge that there was with those modalities to really reach a broader audience. And what I loved about breathwork when I got into it is I had gone to university many years prior to become a doctor, and so I've got a very scientific kind of medical mind.
right.
And I really enjoyed that there was something that I could sink my teeth into, and it wasn't all esoteric. And I recognized that that wasn't going to just be something that pacified my own desire for that scientific understanding or explanation. I recognized that it would be a language that would help me to communicate with other people that weren't so open to the more esoteric concepts.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right there. It's a huge part of our program as well, actually, that both have their place, but actually, the
Mhm.
separation and the total isolation of each, makes us either, I think David Wolf, I think he was the one that coined the phrase, it becomes scientism when the science loses the connection to the mystery, and when we're
Mhm.
too rooted and anchored in the mystery and the esoteric, as you say, either many people won't understand it, won't find it accessible, or it will be off-putting. So I love that you're bringing both in. I think both have a very important place because we are spirit and form. We are both. So I would,
Absolutely.
I mean, I'd
Yeah.
love to kind of weave that in a moment. There's so much you've said there in terms of, your work with hot, cold psychedelics that I want to come back to. But before we do that, I want to know, like, who is Jeff? Like, the man that I see sitting here
Mhm.
before me, and the man who is motivated to bring goodness into the world. You talked about, I get a sense of that young man who wanted to go to medical school. And I saw in your bio that you'd been a
Mhm.
paramedic. So I'm curious about that part. But who were you before that?
Hmm. I think I was very, very lost, very angry, very
Mm,
confused, and very disconnected from my true nature.
mm,
Um, I struggled a lot with mental health, and I just found life really challenging. I just really didn't get it. And, I'd had a lot of experiences through childhood that really just made me question everything. And really, as I moved on into becoming a young adult and I went off to university, I a lot of the repressed anger that was underneath all of that confusion and sadness and kind of despondency really started to bubble up, and I
uh,
wanted answers.
right. So that
And
didn't actually bubble
I
up
had
until then.
correct. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't really have space to prior to that point. And when I was off in the world on my own and left to my own devices, I I think there's a funny thing that can happen when we've experienced a lot of trauma and then we're suddenly removed from that trauma and we just start to create our own to kind of fill that void. And I did that using alcohol to start, and that very quickly led down the path of drugs and harder drugs over time.
Mm,
And that was just a way to cope with all of the big emotions and
mm,
just the not knowing what to do with any of that. And just that I don't know whether you can relate to just an intense sense of confusion in terms of like what is going on? Like why am I here? Like why am I suffering so much? Why am I always in this state? And
mm,
looking back, it's a total victim consciousness. But in that moment, there was really no way to know that. I didn't have the tools, I didn't have the awareness.
mm,
And thankfully, I had those experiences because they led me to that path of seeking answers and to seeking a deeper awareness of what was going on in life
mm,
and to try and understand myself and know myself better.
mm,
So university didn't last very long. I lasted a couple of years there, and that anger piece really had a distaste for anything of authority, any institution. So I quit university. I went back to the small town that I had grown up in and went back to work in forestry and was working out in the bush and had some really severe accidents. And those were really pivotal in really starting to shake up my my black and white kind of thinking of the world. I had
mm.
been very studious and very scientific up until that point, and I'd given up on God very early in life, and I thought everything was very black and white.
Right.
And when I had my first near-death experience, that kind of started to shake things up. It's like, oh, reality is not the way that you think it is. And the second one just like blew that out of the water.
Right.
And after that, I really never went back to being able to see the world in the same way that I did.
Mm,
And that itself led me into even deeper depression, going down the traditional Western allopathic medical um, form of trying to work with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, all of these labels that can take on, and all the pharmaceuticals that can come along with that, and all of the recreational drugs that I was using to try and really just mask all these intense emotions and
mm.
feelings that I was experiencing, and that again that sense of confusion, just not really having a stable footing in the world.
So may
And
I
that it
ask, sorry to interject a moment, but
mhm.
before you continue with that, I kind of feel like it's important. That sense of confusion that led you to be masking with more and more substances and addictions came after the accidents and having the near-death experiences and the kind of awareness that that brought to you that you then didn't know what to do with. Is that correct?
I think the confusion was pretty perpetually present from childhood up until
Yeah.
that point.
Mm.
I think I think what happened with the near-death experiences, the accidents, was a further crumbling of the foundation of what I knew to be reality.
Right.
And so that led to a deeper confusion of what are we doing here and what is this, and that led me on that path of wanting to know, like, who am I and what are we doing here?
Mm.
And I think as well in the second near-death experience, that was I had a sense prior to that I was here for a reason, and that all the suffering, all of the pain, all the experiences had happened for a reason. But it was a pretty light knowing. When I had that second near-death experience, there was a deeper knowing that no, even though this confusion exists, even though you don't get it, even though you feel like there's nothing to really, keep your feet on or, stand on, that, you're here for a reason and you're choosing to be here. And this is your choice. And in that experience, that there was a very distinct choice. It's like, do you want to go back and be in life? Or do you want to kind of call this one off and just keep going?
Right.
And the decision was obviously to come back, and along with that decision, there was a very clear knowing that there was going to be a lot more suffering. It was like, okay,
I,
well, you can go back, and there's also going to be a lot of suffering, and
right.
and yet there was a knowing that was the path.
Wow. That's unusual for me in the sense of, people I've either spoken to who've had near-death experiences or things that I've read about seem to generally focus on this experience of like that inner knowing that you describe, bringing them back with this huge sense of renewed purpose and light and right, this is my mission and this is what I'm here for. But to come back, to make that choice and to identify it, as you said, as a very distinct choice, knowing that there's more suffering is courageous.
Mhm.
Because it's like, oh, really? More?
Hmm.
And what
Yeah,
age were you after
lots
that?
more.
Yeah, oh God, really?
I was That was in 2003, so I was 27 at that time.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay. And
Mhm.
having I mean, I know wisdom comes in, a kind of grounded wisdom, especially when we've been working with plant medicines and the breath and, embodiment practices. But do you stand by the courage of that decision that now you're here, you know what that suffering was for?
Mhm.
And do you feel that you have integrated it to an extent that you're able now to understand that sense of purpose and why you experienced all that?
Yeah, I feel like it all feels very worthwhile, and
Mm.
I'm grateful for all of it. I think I can look back at it fondly at this point, and really be grateful for every single experience along the way, because they've forged who I am in this moment. And I really love who I
Mm.
am, who I'm becoming. And I know that wouldn't be except for every one of those experiences. So, yeah, it was a good choice.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you for choosing to come back and bring your gifts to the world because, you asked in your previous piece, you said, I don't know if you understand, about this kind of the crisis, I suppose, of like, who am I? Why am I here? That can lead us into addiction. I think in my case, I was just in it. I don't feel as though I was ever I'm sure I was at some point, because pain and suffering kind of takes us to those questions. But it's to numb that, it was just like, I'm just in this addiction. I'm not even with the capacity to self-evaluate about what this is about. This, I'm just acting up, acting out, doing the things. And I don't want to leave this too soon, because I think that many people in the world of healing come from, becoming the wounded healer, the one who's experienced those challenges. And you talk about mental health and anxiety, which I think is super important for everybody, but particularly for men who don't get the courage to stand in their heart, or don't find the support to do that as easily. But also on your website, if I may go there, you talk about abuse and incarceration as well as addiction. So
Mm.
what was the pivotal point in that story that brought you out of it?
You know, there was a night I had, so I had had that second near-death experience, and way deeper into addiction. And yet within that addiction, there was kind of this master plan in the back of my mind that I knew that I was getting off drugs. I don't think anybody else could tell from the outside, but I had a plan that I was getting off drugs and that I was getting clean, and that path led me to Mexico.
Mhm.
And when I finally got to Mazatlan after the long windy road to get there, and I landed there, and and kind of steeped in my addiction there for a few months, there was a night where I was shooting crack cocaine, and I realized that I just couldn't continue, and that I just couldn't possibly bear to be addicted in that way anymore. It was like the pain of the addiction became worse than the pain of actually just facing what I needed to face to come out
Yeah.
of it. I had I had my best friend from Canada before I had left. We had had a conversation, and he had said to me, if you get far away and everything stays the same, then you'll know it was you. And
Mm.
I had gone far away, and everything was starting to manifest in the same way. And I realized, okay, I there's something that I'm doing that is creating this.
Yeah.
And that was one of the most beautiful realizations that I could have, because, over time, I've been able to learn how to turn that around and recognize that we are all co-creating our reality. And yet it's sometimes those realizations need to come in the negative before we can implement them in the positive.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I could see how much it touched you, and I could feel it myself.
Mm,
That moment of, it's like the old saying, wherever you go, there you are. That
mhm,
we can cover up all of these things, and not always through things that are as destructive as class A addictions. Sometimes it'll be through
mhm,
workaholism, or endless activity, or inability to settle, or pushing people away, rejecting people who actually love and care for us because it doesn't feel safe. There's so many trauma responses that we see and know. I suspect both of us, well, I know both of us individually, but also through our work as witness to that now. So, in that moment, you got to Mexico, you were manifesting the same things, your friends' words were there with you. I know what courage it takes and how hard it is to get out of hardcore addictions. Did you stay in Mexico to do that?
did, yeah.
Mm.
In in a lot of ways, at that point, I didn't really. Obviously, we always have choice, but I didn't really feel like I had a choice to leave at that point either. I kind of that was kind of the end of the road, and I needed to figure things out from there. And
Right.
luckily, even prior to that, yoga had come into my life. And so I had started going to yoga classes, and that was really starting to draw me in. And so it was actually quite an easy transition, um, from addiction just to dive into that world of yoga, meditation, pranayama,
Mm.
and oh, excuse me.
Mm.
And in a lot of ways that became my new addiction. And yet I'll often tell people that I feel like my whole life has been about harm reduction. And so I recognized that I was diving into something else, but it felt like yoga was a lot more sustainable and a lot more complementary to living a better life than addiction was. So I gratefully assumed that new addiction for the old one.
Yeah, again, I relate a lot, and I love how you frame that as like, you know, the experience of harm reduction, because once we realize that we can trade, you know, one set of behaviors and actions, and if we're still not conscious and if we're still not in the heart, you know, anybody can go through a set of asanas and postures and not be present and not be with themselves and not be with another. You know, it's easier to pinpoint it, and those kind of addictions you're describing are so much more destructive in what it creates in the impact in other people's worlds as well, all of the friends and the family and the loved ones who see us in that
Mm.
space, and the impact it has on ourselves financially, physically, health wise. um so when did you leave Mexico? Did you stay there to complete a yoga training, and had you gone through an addiction cycle?
Uh, that's an interesting story. Um, I did get clean, and I dove into yoga. And I I had the idea come into my field to open a restaurant. And so I opened a restaurant in Mazatlan called Karma Kitchen. And about a year and a half after starting to practice yoga, I started teaching and was teaching on a regular basis, and was, just doing my best to stay out of trouble. And like I said, it felt like I didn't really feel like I had a lot of choices. And so I was doing my best to stay out of trouble, doing my best, and I was working my butt off at the restaurant and teaching yoga classes and doing all the things, and very slowly running out of money.
Mm.
And there's a long story here that I mentioned to you. I'm writing a book about right now, and we'll just say that in that search for money, I ended up in a Mexican jail, and I spent 2 years in a Mexican jail.
Mm.
And at the end of that, when I finally got out, I didn't have a passport or a visa, which means that I was given an assisted return back to Canada. And I arrived back in Canada, and this was a little over 10 years ago. And I had $10 in my pocket. And
That is nothing 10 years ago. Wow.
and and I needed to get myself back together and rebuild a life. And I really just wanted to do that. Even at that time, there was a really sensational story that I probably could have capitalized on and tried to go down that path. But I really just wanted to live a life based on my own merit. And I really wanted to build my own foundation just
Mm.
based on my own hard work. And so that's when I decided to become a paramedic. And that felt really aligned with where I was at morally at that point, in terms of finding a way to be within the system and still doing something that felt meaningful and heart led. And so I became a paramedic, worked for the ambulance service for many years, and like I said, was in this, kind of limbo space of teaching. I recognized that teaching, as much as I wanted to teach and as much as I had to share, that teaching probably wasn't the best way to build that foundation at that point. So I was just really focused on working and my own practices. And that's been a real anchoring point for me throughout this whole journey is my own practice and these periods of going into teaching, and then but throughout that really being anchored and focused in my own personal practice. So I just dove into that over those first few years that I was back out, and then eventually we got to the point where I recognized that, yeah, breath is a thing that I really want to dive into. And then that's where breathARMY came in. And then since then, there's been no looking back.
So the trainings that you did with Stig Severinsen and Wim Hof and Patrick McKeown and some of these other teachers, at what point did they come in when you say the breath then was becoming inspiring? You had your practices. And by the way, hats off to you, because 10 years is not long. My mother died. It'll be 10 years in May since she passed. Since I also sold my food businesses that I set up on the back of my addictions as well. There's a lot of similarities that I'm hearing here that are really moving me. But I feel like a decade is a relatively short amount of time for the amount that you've achieved, to come back with nothing, to go into becoming a paramedic, and now to build your business. So where did the studies come in? Had you already done those studies at this point, the breathwork ones specifically?
No, it was just when I decided to dive in, I just dove in head first. And there was a couple of years where I was literally just flying around the world and invested basically everything I had into the trainings and learning from the best teachers that I could. And
Mm,
Wim was the first one that really came in that drew me in, and cold exposure was a huge step forward in my process. That was a huge boost in confidence and just that inner knowing. It's like, oh yeah, I can do anything.
why?
And I think because if I could get in the ice cold ocean in the dark at 5 o'clock in the morning and go in there and sit in the cold, it felt like I could do anything.
Right.
And I had always had a fear of the cold. I hated the cold. And that it just flipped a switch, and it's a switch that I've seen flip for so many of the other people that I trained with, so many of the people that have come to the workshops that I've done. It's, there's something very primal there that can switch for people.
Agree.
And it's like all of a sudden this light bulb goes on. It's like, holy shit, I'm capable of way more than I thought I was. And what other stories am I telling myself that are just absolutely not true?
Mm,
And, I think when I get focused on something, I get pretty hyper focused, and there's not, I think as a result of all of the experiences that I've had in my life, there's just a sense of this is what I'm doing, and that forward movement
mm,
comes very naturally. So I dove in, and I think what I learned in that path of breathwork is it unfolded quite quickly. And what I was recognizing, and I think you and I may have chatted about this at some point, but um, I was traveling around and I was doing all these different trainings, and most of them were focused on big breathing at that point. And, I got somewhere along the way and I realized that I still didn't know how to breathe. And that was a real light bulb moment, is that I was having these big kind of peak experiences, but then going back into patterns that weren't serving me. And it's
mm,
like, well, what is the missing piece? And that's when I came across Patrick's work, and then I dove more into the functional breathing that led me to Brian Mackenzie, and working with Brian for many years. while I was working with Brian, that's where Peter Litchfield came into my field. And it's like, okay, like here's a missing link. And it really felt like, bridging those worlds between those more spiritual trauma release type practices with this integrative practice that we could really be utilizing in real time, day to day, moment to moment. To me, that was just such a catalyst for my own transformation and really fueled this desire to share in a way that at
Mm.
that time it didn't feel like there was many people bridging that gap. And maybe you can relate to this as well, that it still doesn't feel like there's a lot of people that are seeing the need to share both of these sides of the equation
Yeah.
in order to get a more holistic
Yeah.
um, tool or perspective on the potential that the breath has as a tool to both, to create these transcendent states of consciousness and have these wild insights and connections with God, but also to be this moment to moment tool that we constantly, always 24/7, 365 days a year have access to, that
Hmm.
provides this anchor that we can kind of hold on to and provides us this way to create a little bit of space so that we can start to see these patterns unfolding in real time and start to create a little bit of space to respond differently. And to me, that's where the real changes come in our life.
Yeah.
It's like that's where we get to integrate the insights that we have in these big peak experiences, whether it be breath work or psychedelics or whatever it is. The
Mm-hmm.
integration happens in the mundane, day to day boring moments of life, the
100%.
conversations, like it's like that's where the real unraveling and transition, I think, really happens. So I got super passionate about that, and that's kind of led us to where we're at right now.
Yeah, and you've just expressed that so beautifully. One thing I want to highlight, that gorgeous inquiry that you made of yourself that you just shared. What other stories am I telling myself about what I
Hmm.
can and can't do? I thought that was so beautiful because for me, that's very much the essence of a lot of what we do, that we're kind of unlearning all of those programs and conditionings. And no wonder many of us kick against authority when actually we have that
Hmm.
in a sense that something is not right here, or my voice isn't welcome here.
Hmm.
Why not? What's so threatening about that? But the other thing, it makes me smile
Hmm.
because as much as I see many of the spiritual communities like poo-pooing the science, well, that's not so important because, it's the mystical that matters. I also see the science community, and I'm going to say this with great fondness and affection because Patrick now teaches on our training. He teaches the science bit of functional breathing on
Hmm.
our breathwork training. And I had to convince him as well, that it was worth him coming on because connected breathing has a place. It's a different modality and it has a place and it
Absolutely.
opens things up in different ways. And when we can then marry that with an understanding of the science so we can recognize who it is and isn't suitable for, what is happening, how to be with that, how to be in relation with that, but also to go, yeah, but if we only stay with the functional aspects, we might never touch upon those things. You know, it's the same with
Hmm.
psychedelics. It's kind of like it's not for everybody. Sure, of course not, but it's like there are things that we don't always know of the brain, mind, and the rationale that I think have immense value. So I'm really, yeah, I'm excited and I'm happy to hear that you bring that into your work as well. And I really hope that more people do, actually, because if we can't
Hmm.
integrate what we experience in those peak moments, if we're endlessly seeking and then not learning how to continue to chop wood, carry water, and do the dishes, and do the laundry, and take the bins out, and oh, something's just stressed me. We were talking a bit about triggers before we came online. If we can't learn how to manage those moments through regulating our nervous system and our breath, We're not going to suddenly lie down and go, oh my God, I'm really upset. I need to do some big breathing. It's more like, no, how do I hold this part of myself that feels under threat right now? Which is usually what's happening when some residue of the past comes in and activates that response in our nervous system. Anyway, I was just deeply excited by what you were sharing. So I want to ask you as well, what continues to inspire you in your work as presumably that work continues to grow?
Mhm. It's really interesting how these pieces that land at a certain point in our life. It's kind of like a song that you listen to at one point in your life, and then you listen to it 10 years later, and you realize that you didn't get it at all. And there's like a whole another layer of meaning underneath it. And then you might listen to it 10 years later, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's this whole other layer that I didn't see. And I feel like that has happened with breathARMY, and it's really happened with that mission statement, of educating, inspiring, and empowering people to live their true potential.
Mm,
And my understanding of what true potential is continues to evolve.
mm,
And so as that evolves, then the way that I share in the world and the tools that I use and the way that I focus my communication changes in order to support that understanding. And I think what's really important to me right now is this understanding of who we truly are. And I have a belief system. I recognize that we create belief structures and narratives, and that creates our reality. And in my belief system, I believe that we're going through a massive collective awakening right now. And I don't think that people have an option but to awaken. I think it's happening for all of us. And there's some people that are more aware of that process happening, and some people that are completely unaware of that process happening. But I believe in that process that we're all waking up to our true nature, which in my belief system is that we are all an aspect of the divine expressing and creating reality. And we've really collectively created a nightmare. And so I think that one of the most important things that I can do is help people to remember who they are and to recognize the great responsibility that we each have in creating our collective reality, and that it's really time for us to do the deep work to uncover these old traumas, these old triggers, these old patterns of belief that aren't serving us, that are holding us in victim mentality, preventing us from really tapping into our true power, and
mm,
really helping people utilizing these different modalities to let go of those old beliefs, let go of the old patterns, the old traumas, the old stories, and really come into the now and really harness that potential and collectively focus it in a different way. And I
mm.
think that we're really in a moment where that is of critical importance, that we wake up to that fact and that we kind of turn this ship around. So that's what really lights me up right now.
Mm. Just gonna take a moment to take that in because I agree. I think it's absolutely fundamental. And to come back to your friends thing about, if this happens when you leave, it's kind of like the same kind of energy. It's like it all starts in here, all starts within. The change also
Mhm.
starts within the commitment to change as well as the commitment to dysfunction when that shows up. But the commitment to change and the capacity to change starts within. But we all need, I believe anyway, in my belief system, we need each other. We need support. We need to be inspired. We need to be uplifted. We need to be encouraged. We need to be held and loved and supported and connected with, and in the many ways that we can do that. I salute and applaud your devotion to your work and making that happen. Like there's nothing more important. you know. I would also like to briefly touch upon the fact that I noticed in your bio you also mentioned movement. Is that through breath and yoga, or is that movement through dance or some other kind of
Mm.
movement? I'm curious about that.
All of the above.
All of the above.
So yeah,
Mm,
so I always see yoga as really the foundation of my transformation. So I think will always have a place in my heart,
mm,
and I think it is such a powerful modality for people. And so I love to teach yoga. Ecstatic dance has been a piece that really shifted my
mm,
consciousness and the way that I move in the world. And so that's something that I love to bring into the work that I do. And I really believe that our body is our temple,
mm.
and that we need a strong temple. And so with that, I love calisthenics and body weight workouts and that kind of stuff as well, to really hone and tune and strengthen that temple, that provides the foundation for this deeper connection with life and deeper expression. So yeah, all the kinds of movement.
Wow, you have really inspired me, in this relatively short conversation that we've had. I think the biggest aspect of what's inspired me is the reinforcement of the huge value of that healing journey, that we don't always know. Sometimes we're just drawn to things out of desperation. I need to do something. I went to ecstatic dance for the first time when my son was just 6 months old, and I was having so many problems and issues with my body. It was just stopping responding to me, and it was really quite scary. And he was the third of my three children. And somebody said, I think maybe you'd benefit from going to, a movement class, a ecstatic, it was 5 rhythms at the time. I spent the whole hour working out how to try and get out of the room because it felt so uncomfortable for me to be in a light room with all these people in full expression. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? But I stayed. And afterwards I was like, oh, I feel something different. I feel a bit better. I feel less symptomatic. So I went back and I went back, and every
Mm,
week for 19 years pretty much I went back and I went back. So
wow.
I love that you've brought in that these are foundational pieces of shifting our consciousness, of shifting our awareness as we
Mhm.
shift our body, as we move the body. And yeah, I really, really want to thank you for you've warmed my heart in this conversation today, Jeff, really.
Mm. It's been a real pleasure to be here and to share. I feel like I have a little bit of underlying sadness because I want to know more about you as well. But I think we'll have to leave that for another conversation. So maybe I'll have to interview you at some point because I'd love to know more of your
Yeah.
story as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I like you. I'm trying to consider how my book will find its way to be spoken to the world. And you are now in the Dominican Republic, hopefully
Mhm,
intentionally creating your story. I look forward to reading that very much. Where can
mhm.
people find you, Jeff?
Yeah, well, as you said earlier, like we connected on Instagram. I spend most of my energy and focus in the social media world on Instagram. So breathARMY on Instagram, and breathARMY.com as well, the website. People can find all the different offerings on there, and continually evolving and expanding and growing and all the things. So
You're
yeah.
the things. That's so Canadian, isn't it? I know I hear that a lot. I love it. A few of my Canadian friends say, all the things. So I'm going to pop those links below the show notes so that you can find Jeff and that you can find some of the places that he's been and studied, because they're people and teachings that I value enormously as well. And yeah, keeping it simple at breathARMY and breathARMY.com. Jeff, thank you so
Mhm.
much. I
Mm.
really, really wish you well on this book writing mission, and may it be full of inspirational landscapes, people, and moments that just allow your heart to express its voice through your writing.
Thank you so much, Steph. I feel really blessed to have this opportunity and to have landed here. be able to enjoy the sunshine this winter and be able to share some of those thoughts on paper. So yeah, thanks for having me on, and thanks to everybody who's still watching at this point. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.